understanding the DevOps life cycle is important. So before I'm getting into the DevOps life cycle, what exactly DevOps life cycle is and why is it important? Let me explain you this. Earlier in the beginning days, even now in most of the projects even, because 100% DevOps implementation, we are not expecting in 100% in the projects. Slowly people are migrating. That's a different thing altogether. Earlier, if you see any application you see, there will be some analysis, there will be some design. When there is a design, implementation will be taken place. Subsequently, that will be tested, that will be deployed and delivered. This is the process. Any application, this is the process. But nowadays, if you see most of the projects or most of the requirements of the customers, we are delivering the project in phase wise. The first point, we are not delivering the complete project at a time because volatility and requirements are more. We never know what kind of requirement customer wants. So short iterations is what something which by implementing agile is what something we are following nowadays. But this is agile environment for application development, wherein we need to know about the product vision scope, right? So this is all something anyway you have learned. Parallelly, there is a life cycle for application development people. I'm talking about DevOps teams. I'm talking about application developers should understand the DevOps environment. Why? Because there are two things. One is about development, second is operations. Means implementation operations, whatever you can call. Means there will be some amount of code will be written and this will be tested and delivered. This is the structure. For example, if there are any changes happens in between, once the code was written, for example, if there are new changes were happened in between of the project, what we used to do, we have to go back to the phase of analysis. We have to do some planning. We have to make some changes if any is required in the application development. Again, designs will be of different things. We have to make some design changes followed by implementation. This is a continuous and as well as continuous process, depends on the market needs and demands, which is becoming inevitable nowadays. So if you follow the adaptable practices of the earlier days, because in the beginning days, whatever the process we follow, especially for the problem for the development team is that they have to do the same work again and again. For the same work, they are spending twice and thrice amount of effort. Duration is extending. Cost is also getting extended because problems, there will be a problem for the company in context to the cost, etc. All that. So there must be some pipeline. This is where generally we call it as CI/CD pipeline. We call it as there is a pipeline in DevOps environment you might have heard about, which is called CI/CD. CI/CD we call it as. CI/CD means continuous integration, continuous deployment and delivery. Okay, means there is a continuous integration of new things. Any new functionalities were added that has to be integrated. And continuous deployment has to be taken care of. That was the situation now. Earlier, there was no situation of that. Earlier, because requirement changes were very limited, hardly you see. And that too, we used to deliver the project when it is completed 100%. That was the beginning days. But now, due to the situation in the business, in the market, there are a lot of changes happens. So the development team facing the problem in managing all these activities. For that reason, there is an environment. I always say DevOps is an environment more than, it's not a technology. I don't prefer that to use a word called technology, but DevOps is an environment. This is an environment where DevOps means development and operations. Both development and operations team will work together. Why? Because in the beginning, even now in some projects, we see closely development means people who write the code and all, everything will be separate. Deployment team is separate because there will be a deployment team for the project which will be assigned. And this deployment team normally works for multiple projects because there won't be any one deployment team for one project. For example, if you take any organization, they have 10 accounts. For example, 10 customers, 10 accounts. Deployment team, maybe 3, 4 deployment teams will be there. So two projects, for two projects, there will be one deployment team will be assigned to them. So this deployment team responsibility is to deploy the application. They are responsible for deployment, not for the development. There is always a communication gap between these two, development and as well as deployment team. There is always a communication gap arises. Because of the situation, if there is any volatility in changes in the application or the functionalities taken place, always there is the state of confusion will be there. First of all, confusion. Second, there is a difference of opinions, everything. That's how generally it is there for a very long time. So development team as separate, deployment team as separate. Perceptions, their expectations and all everything were different. So there is a possibility of, I don't say conflict, but there is a possibility of confusion when they are working for the projects. In regard to that, by reducing this complexity, by reducing these problems, there is an environment which came nowadays is called DevOps environment. DevOps environment means both development and operations works on the same platform. This is what we call it as DevOps environment stands for. It's a life cycle. What kind of life cycle? This life cycle have different stages. You can see over here. That's what I'm showing you. There are different stages are there. The first one is called continuous development. I'll explain you the points first, then I'll explain you the detailed part. The first one about development, second was integration, third was testing, fourth is monitoring, feedback, deployment, and operations. This is the structure. Means normally to develop this, we work on Azure DevOps tool. This is not something 100% feasible in Jira tool because Jira is a tool which predominantly we are using in agile environment. As agile is becoming mandatory for applications nowadays, even DevOps environment is also becoming mandatory from the development side, okay, from the development people. Because for example, if you are a developer, Java developer earlier, now if you want to become a uh, if you want to extend your career and all, now you have to be a full stack developer. Full stack developer means you must be having experience in doing some front end, back end, middleware, everything, right? That was the situation now. That's what we call it as full stack development. Full stack means complete. Either it can be full stack Java, it will be full stack .NET, it can be full stack Python, whatever it is. Full stack. That's how generally even business analyst also full stack. That's what we are doing now. From the BA context, full stack is from the BA context, but full stack context. So developers nowadays are slowly transforming themselves. Organizations required people, whoever is having a knowledge over the DevOps life cycle. To implement the DevOps life cycle, one of the prominent tool which normally we call as Azure DevOps. There is a tool, right? As Jira, we have another tool called Azure DevOps. Because Azure is a cloud platform. Because now and then most of the projects are running on cloud account. One of the prominent tool, okay? Because I don't say only one, but one of the prominent tool called Azure DevOps. Azure platform, DevOps environment. It's called Azure DevOps as a whole. You can see it's a tool. Using this Azure DevOps tool, there is a pipeline has to be created because development team, okay, do remember this and do understand this from the development perspective because there is no such role for a business analyst in this point number one. But why are we learning? Because as I already stated, because we are learning business analyst full stack, it's always important for us to know about the context of DevOps and how it works and functions. Do remember this point, okay? So development team, whoever is working on the DevOps environment, they have to create some data pipeline, DevOps pipeline. This is where we call it as creating pipeline for CI and CD. Means continuous integration. Integration, why? Because there are a lot of things we're coming and adding in future. We have to create a pipeline in such a way where if there is any kind of changes happens and all, this pipeline should not be disturbed for whatsoever reason. Means if there is any new changes happens or any add-ons were added, So this existing pipeline should not be disturbed, so that we have to create a pipeline in such a way so that if there is any changes happens and all, that changes must be a part of the pipeline. For this, there is a tool predominantly we use called Azure DevOps. It's a kind of tool where development team should have a knowledge over the creating of CI/CD pipelines. But to implement these pipelines, there are a lot of tools are involved. This is where technology comes into picture, because if a person wants to become a DevOps engineer, underline this point, you must have a knowledge over the tools. Okay, if you want to become a DevOps engineer, not you, I'm generalizing this statement. If you want to be a DevOps engineer, or if you want to be a DevOps professional, from the technical side you're coming from Java or some other programming languages, etc. So we need to have experience over the tools. Something like Jenkins. Jenkins is one kind of tool which is used for integration purpose. At the same time, we have other tools called Docker. Docker is something used for the container, right? So containers and all. At the same time, Kubernetes. I think a couple of times I explained about the importance of Kubernetes in the previous sessions. You know that. Kubernetes, Ansible, Negois. GitHub. GitHub is one kind of code repository. For example, developers has written some code. Where do they store the code? There must be some repository to store the code. So these are the different tools DevOps people have to be known with. Right? That's how generally the journey and transformation has been taken place. So a person who wants to transform their career towards the DevOps environment completely, they should understand the life cycle of DevOps first, and how this DevOps pipelines to be created, how this CI/CD pipeline has to be created using different tools. Either it can be Azure DevOps, or else there are other tools even. Some are open source tools, some are paid tools, right? So different tools and all that. So how to create CI/CD pipelines is what something they have to be good with. Along with that, they need to have some knowledge over the tools, whatever the tools I was mentioned you so far, like Jenkins, Kubernetes, Ansible, Negois, GitHub, right? So integrations, doing the integration, because these are all integrated, because Jenkins is for integration. GitHub is for code repository. Kubernetes, where if you want to deploy multiple applications in one single platform, you require some virtual machines to be created, Kubernetes. Docker is for containers. This is what something DevOps environment stands for. But from the BA perspective, if we being a business analyst, we need to understand the DevOps lifecycle. These are all stages are these as follows. The first one is called continuous development for the first point, right? So if there is a life cycle of DevOps, if you understand, so continuous development is required. Why continuous development? Because there are some objectives of the project, whatever we have created so far might be changed in future. At the same time, requirements are also changing accordingly, because when there is an objective or the goal is changed according to the customer needs, automatically it is reflecting on the requirements also. When there are any changes in requirements taken place, automatically this will be impacted on the implementation on the context of code, etc. All that. So if we are a BA, we are responsible for the requirements, because we are the people who is responsible for the requirements, all that. The first step in DevOps life cycle is all about continuous development. Continuous development means you are planning some objectives. At the same time, the kind of code for the requirements is what something DevOps team has to know with. You are a BA, if there is any changes, you are updating, okay? But when you are working on the DevOps environment, you must be knowing about the life cycle. This is what you are learning now, okay? Continuous development is the first one. Second is continuous integration. Why continuous integration? Because if you say, if there are any requirements taken place earlier, we used to prepare some test cases, etc. I have already told you. So test cases, test scenarios will be created in manual testing. So once it is going for automation testing, we have to make some changes in the automation, right? So using different tools on that. If there is any change happens in middle of the project, what you have to do? Again, you have to go back to the previous, right from the unit testing part. You have to make unit testing changes and all. You have to do your testing life cycle from the scratch. So this is something a tedious and as well as complicated job for a testing team to do it. So that's the reason why there is a continuous integration approach has to be created in the DevOps life cycle, because if you are building any kind of product, we need to plan the testing and all everything in such a way where this continuous integration must be taken place. Means if there is any kind of integration is being taken place, there must be some continuous integration has to happen. Means if there is any changes are happening, we have to make some subsequent changes in between. This is where we call it as continuous integration will be all about. Once we have done the integration, what we have to do? We have to do the testing, because changes happens, adopted whatever the changes we have adopted to the application. Subsequently, those has to be tested. This is for that you have to verify the product, because to what extent this product is usaged, because 100% product won't be used in the real world. In the beginning level, I told you in the beginning also. For example, you are developing a product, you are developing it in phase wise, not at a time. Whatever is needed, you are developing it. So when you are developing, when you want to deliver this finally, deploy and deliver this finally, you must assess the actual usage. What is the practical possibility of usage is what something which you have to be known with. This is what something which we call it as continuous testing. So continuous integration is required. At the same time, continuous testing is also something essentially needed. Okay, continuous development is required. Continuous integration is needed. Continuous testing is also required over here. So continuous testing is what something which we have to be performed with. Means continuous integration we have to make. At the same time, we have to do some continuous testing, etc. All that in this regard. So once the continuous testing, we have to monitor. We have to monitor the output, whatever the kind of problems we have, right? So those problems has to be identified, and we have to identify how this can be rectified. This is where continuous monitoring is required. Monitoring in context to the performance, because how the product is performing, to what extent it is reaching the goals and business objectives of the customer, what they're expecting. So that understanding is always needed. It is always required here. This is where generally continuous monitoring is needed, because we have to monitor in regular intervals, monitoring the output of the product, what is that are we going to deliver, and we need to identify if there is any kind of problems were existed, how to do the corrections, because this is monitoring is a continuous process in any product or a project development we do, because monitoring the status of the work, what is that we are doing. At the same time, if there is any kind of changes happens in between, we have to make understood, and we have to make some subsequent changes in between. This is where generally continuous monitoring comes into picture. So once continuous monitoring, then next we need to have the feedback, because if there is any monitoring of the product was taken, we have to take the feedback, because if you want to improvise the product, right? Because if you want to release any kind of new release versions quickly, right? So because in future, let's say for example, if you are taken some Jira tool, right? So Jira earlier it was only Jira is only for project tracking, right? So epics and user stories and all. Now, if you have seen closely in Jira tool, there was nothing called goals as such earlier. Nowadays, recently there was an option called goals were added in the Jira tool itself. Next, nowadays, if you see when we are writing the project rules, because Jira administrators will do that. When there are any kind of project rules, if you are going to write for any business rules or project rules we are writing, nowadays there is an AI